What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. So I want to talk about this week's past episode, which aired yesterday at 9:30 p.m. Easter Sunday, episode 7 of season 1 of Winning Time: The Rise of the Lakers Dynasty. Um, as with most of these episodes, well, I guess all of them, there's usually like a couple of different storylines going on. Now, um, as far as the financial issues that Dr. Jerry Buss was going through in the past episode, it's been determined that what could salvage him financially is if the Lakers have a long, sustained playoff run where um, attendance, uh, the prestige of winning a championship, and um, something about the depreciation of assets when it comes to players' salaries would pretty much salvage all, I guess, most of his debt, if not all of his debt issues, and eventually turn the Lakers into a surplus situation for Dr. Jerry Buss and the organization as a whole. It's also been determined that his mother has metastatic cancer and that the cancer had been causing her to have strokes. She had been suffering small strokes, which was causing the weird behavior that she had been displaying lately. So that situation developed. Um, Also, the Lakers are mired or were mired in this episode in a losing streak since um, Paul Westhead took over as head coach. And Paul Westhead has shown himself to be not a man suited for the position. Um, he's definitely not suited for the position personality wise. He just is not used to being in this position. He's not a people person. Um, he begins to further alienate his position or his relationship with Spencer Haywood. And the players are basically just running plays out there and ignoring him. He's being outcoached virtually every game. And Paul Westhead recognizes this. So he brings up to Pat Riley, who at this point has been a color commentator for the legendary Chick Hearn. He begs actually Pat Riley to join him as his assistant. And now we're seeing the steps that took place for Pat Riley to assume his eventual role. It's also in this episode that Pat Riley it shows he's very image conscious. And when Pat Riley was first introduced, he uh, had the long hair and the long mustache, which is what he wore in the 1970s. But this episode, he's finally shaved off the mustache. And you see brief flashes of Pat Riley in the future, you know. But we're seeing the beginnings of what most people are assume are the Lakers. Most people, when we think of the Los Angeles Lakers of the 80s, we think of Magic, Kareem, Worthy, we think of Pat Riley. But he was not the original head coach. It was Jack McKinney. And then Paul Westhead. And then eventually Pat Riley. But it was a series of events which led to that. In a visit home to Lansing, Michigan, his father is very leery of his son's relationship with his business manager, who he correctly, and I said this in a prior review. I said that I don't trust this guy. He seems like he's business minded, which is a good thing. He didn't really particularly care that Magic didn't want to settle down with his daughter. But there's something about him that shows he's snakish, and this is what I'm starting to sense with him. Um, Number one, he's trying to usurp everybody else and become the number one force in Magic's life. And he's trying to do it with the lure of money and glamour and fame and all that shit. I also suspect that he had something to do with planning those women around Cookie that said something about how Magic uh, picks one out of the stands after every night. I wouldn't be surprised if he had them plan it right there. You know what I'm saying? So Magic is very leery. Excuse me, the father is very very leery of that. He you know he talks about this with Kareem. Um, Trying to think of other things going on in this episode. We also see the first appearance of Larry Bird. The guy who plays Larry Bird looks just like goddamn Larry Bird. I mean, he's the spin image of Larry Bird. You get a sense of his personality, the trash talking, all of that. But there's a very important game that the Lakers must win. All right. It's a marquee game the Lakers must win in order for Paul Westhead to salvage his job because they're right there on the phone with Elgin Baylor, former Lakers great. At that time, just removed himself from the Utah Jazz organization. I think he got fired and looking for a coaching position. So he's right there. And ultimately, they win that game, the Lakers. Another thing that comes to mind in this episode, man, is Magic. I can now I'm starting to understand why Magic doesn't like this series. I'm telling you, I'm not saying Magic is a bad person, and I know this isn't all documented. I guess I suppose some of this stuff is done for cinematic responses and cinematic reasons, but the scene that shows Magic would stoop to the point of sleeping with Cookie's friend, that's kind of low, man. That's real fucking low, and it's showing that Magic is really good at duplicity. By that I mean he's a charming individual. He can smile in your face, um, and he can compartmentalize a lot of his bad activities and behaviors. Uh, it's almost like he recognizes that there are two Johnsons. There's Irvin, and then there's Magic. And you know, Irving is a very charming individual, and I get the sense that when he was talking to Cookie in that hotel room, he was talking to her as Irvin. But Magic Showtime Johnson is a whole nother thing, and that's why he fucked her friend, which I think is going to be found out eventually. So anyway, another great episode in my opinion. Those of you who watched it, tell me what you guys think.